Does the sheer vastness of the universe make the inference to God based on fine-tuning less compelling? Couldn't one argue that God wasted a lot of space, no pun intended, in order to create life? When we think about the vastness of space, which is mind-boggling even to write as a mathematical equation, one of the things that we run into is that there's a lot of space in space. This is one of the fundamental things about some of our sci-fis, especially as it comes to those who might be friends of Star Trek. One of the things about Star Trek is that they are exploring. They are depending on if you watch the original series, they're on a 5-year mission, or if you watch some of the later ones, the continuing mission is to explore strange new worlds, right? Well, those strange new worlds of which they are exploring are based upon the ability to actually observe them. In order to observe them, you have to actually be near enough to see it. And the challenge with any sort of observation about the universe, especially as it comes to seeing distant galaxies and so on and so forth, is that we run into fundamental realities of physics. Light travels at a certain maximum speed in a vacuum. And therefore, because it doesn't have because it has a built-in speed limiter, so to speak, light can only get to our observation in a certain amount of time. And if you have probably heard several different references to the idea of light years, it's how far light travels in a year based upon the constant in a vacuum. You know that even the closest galaxy to us is multiple light years away. And not even to put too fine a point on it, but if you are able to travel as fast as the speed of light, you're able to travel significantly faster than we've ever traveled before. And even so, light doesn't get to certain galaxies except after thousands of light years. And so the thing is that to even be able to travel close enough to be able to directly observe something without any fancy technology, so to speak, is it's a high bar to be able to have to jump over. However, an inference could be made, as does this question asker, of if there's so much space between things that are created bodies, if we say that from the theistic perspective, why is there so much empty space? Why is there so much wasted space, so to speak? And if that's the case, why is the universe so big in the first place? Now, this line of logic would be appropriate if we had the static model of the universe. Remember, in earlier models of the universe, there was an argument being made that the universe was static. It simply has always existed in perpetuity in the way that it existed. As we move on in our observations, we have the theory of the Big Bang. And that more and more and more evidence piled up for, to the point to where that's simply an assumed position of the scientific community because it explains so many things, and there are so many pieces of evidence that point to that, being that the universe had a beginning. However, one of the consequences of the Big Bang and the redshift and the cosmic background radiation and so on and so forth is that this particular bang is still traveling apart from itself. Because we can observe the redshift, we can still say that objects are moving farther apart from themselves, and in a way that is predictably mathematically. You're able to make accurate measurements based upon what we can observe and know about the movement of celestial bodies away from themselves. And because of that, the universe, from a particular point, begins to rapidly expand, and likewise continues to do so over a significantly long period of time. Now again, this is where the geologic time scale might make perhaps some of us nervous if we think only of creation as a literal 6-day creation. If you instead take perhaps an analogic or even a little bit of a metaphorical perspective of the creation story in Genesis, what you can begin to perhaps point to is that this expanding of the universe in such a way as to continuously be moving apart from themselves over a significantly long geologic timescale, millions of years, billions of years, so to speak. The point is that these celestial bodies have continued to move apart from each other. And because they've continued to move apart from each other, the fact that there is vacuous space between celestial bodies should not come as a surprise to us, but rather as an outcome in the ways in which the universe itself formed. Now, the question is, why did God waste so much space, so to speak? Well, this is maybe a question that perhaps can be turned on its head a little bit when we talk about the unobservable part of the universe. Polkinghorne mentioned, and it is highly theorized, there's a lot of evidence that points to this, that there is a significant amount of the universe that is simply non-observable but nonetheless real. There is a large part of the universe that theoretically seems to be made up of dark matter and dark energy. Entities in which we don't know the full ins and outs of them, we don't know exactly how they work precisely, but there are mathematical ways of describing certain phenomena that are nonetheless seemingly proven to be reliable. It's sort of like saying we have no clue how gravity actually works. However, we do have formulas that can accurately describe the forces of gravity. We know for a mathematical fact that gravity is a particular set of relationships between things that have mass and the distance that's between them. We can describe that pretty well by that mathematics. However, we can not even say remotely that we have any sort of core idea as to how gravity actually works. We can say the effects of what gravity does upon certain objects and what the variables and what the constants might be in this case, but we have no kind of base understanding as to how that force actually works. But we can also perhaps say the same thing about the observable universe. It might not be that there's simply dead space between places, but we actually, if we kind of go back to the quantum foam, that there's not a vacuousness in subatomic physics, but rather there is a lot of lines that tether things together in subatomic physics that we simply just don't know how they work. We can describe them mathematically, though. There are ways in which we can reliably say that quarks exist. There are ways that we can say that electrons exist, even though we can't quite pin down exactly what they look like or even know where they are at certain points. But again, the fact that the universe is so big is a function of the rapid expansion of the universe, which means that the universe had a beginning, which means that, for the theist, this is a creation of God. Something that wasn't there all of a sudden was. And the fact that the universe is so vacuous may say more about our limited ability to describe it rather than how the universe actually is in its fullness. When you talk about systems, you seem surprised at patterns that appear seemingly magically out of your perceived probability of randomness. I dispute that this is remarkable. It is only systems that are not well understood yet that seem to produce magical results. The fact that we are all here, the things you describe, the air that you are breathing, they exist. That is all. It cannot be explained. Everything else, all arguments pointing to something mysterious, something not yet discovered, something science has overlooked or cannot explain, may well be explained one day. What this question is asking might be a little bit hard to kind of figure out based upon how the question is stated, but the main point of this question is, the question asker is disputing that the arising of new or unexplained sorts of phenomena in science is not remarkable at all. It's simply the statement of reality. It's sort of like saying that the fact that I don't know how gravity functions is not remarkable in itself, and the fact that there is some mysterious indeterminacy is only because of the limits of our understanding of the science and not based upon some magical principle to begin with. Now, the pushback on this is particularly about Does science explain phenomena based upon a static number of laws in the universe? Now again, this is something that gets into some of our previous understandings in science and our more emerging edge of science. Whenever we're talking about fundamental forces in the universe, like we talked about last class, or last couple of chapters, we're talking about where are our reference points? What can we say in the universe that is objective and not simply referential off of something that is subjective? The difference between saying my hand is the length of this book, or 2 hand lengths is this book, and saying that the book is a precise measurement based upon an objective standard. Well, it gets a fair bit more complicated when we take a static universe sort of understanding into the physical phenomena we're trying to describe. So it might be that the universe exploded, is expanding, and that's simply due to the laws of nature without any exterior force acting upon it. And because of that, because there are only interior forces, only the stuff within the universe caused the universe as it is, then we have to have some sort of explanatory principle for explaining all that there is within the world based upon whatever those preconditions of the universe were. And once we discover those preconditions of the universe, or discover those forces that we just don't know the names of yet, so to speak, then we can describe everything in the universe in a non-mysterious manner. Now, that's one way of looking at the ways in which science is exploring the ways in which we know anything at all about the physical universe. But there's also a competing set of premises that actually say the universe is not static in the same sense that the universe in its causal forces at the beginning of the universe and rapid expansion also, by necessity of, let's say, for example, a more evolutionary sort of understanding of the universe, and I'm talking about the physical universe, not biology, I'm talking about the universe itself, is that there is a progression of certain principles that do arise newly and are not simply present all at the very beginning, and we simply have to discover them. And one of the ways that this is argued is that of the principle of indeterminacy. If we do actually take the principle of indeterminacy as an actual baked-in thing to the universe, as Polkinghorne and Beale do, one of the things that we then have to hold our hands up to is that if there is a built-in, not just indeterminacy, but to use Polkinghorne's words, there's a built-in potentiality of the universe in which things are being brought into reality that haven't existed before, then we have new phenomena that we are therefore observing as that expansion of the universe continues to, let's say, bump into other things. Take this as an analogy. When you are playing a game of pool, you set up your pool balls in the little triangle, and you have your cue ball that's at the other end of the table, and which is launched at high speed into this sort of triangle. Okay. When you launch it in there, you hit a whole bunch of balls, and they scatter all kinds of places. And based upon how we can describe that motion, we can say, if we know enough information about the table, if we know enough information about the balls in play, that we could predict, based upon the physical collision of these things, where all these balls are going to end up. This is roughly what we can do in physics. This is why we can put people on the moon. This is why we can put rovers on Mars, and this is why we can see galaxies that are so very far away that we would never in our lifetimes be able to see it. But at the same time, one of the things about that analogy is that we are assuming that if we hit this the same way every time, that everything within this physical system will then end up the same. In a perfect system, that would work. The problem is that we work in imperfect systems. This is something that if you've been in any basic physics class, you have the ideal world of physics where everything works just the way that it should. And the unfortunate thing is that we don't work in an ideal world of physics. There are all kinds of unpredictable phenomena that cause our perfect systems to never quite work out as what we thought that they would work. And because this is the case, what Polkinghorne and others actually argue is that this indeterminacy is not something that will wildly make science impossible, but rather it is a principle in which new principles arise that are not contradictory to previous principle, but rather are a natural sort of outcome, or to use that language, evolution of the ways in which the universe has expanded and gone to the moments in which we can actually observe today. It's sort of like saying, in the same sort of ways in the biological sense, that we observe biology in a way that would be unable to be observed in ages past 2,000 years ago. It's the same sort of thing as saying that we have extinct species that used to be alive, and we have species that would never have existed in this particular way these many years ago. By the way, the domestication of certain animals can maybe fall into this category. But let's sum this up. There are two positions we're talking about here. One that says that the universe already is working in ways in which we simply need to observe and explain, and then as soon as we can do that, there's no more mystery in the process. Whereas Beale and Polkinghorne are saying that, no, there is built-in indeterminacy in the process in which new phenomena arise from it that cannot, by necessity, be predicted by the ways in which we simply do low-level physics, so to speak. And both of these have merit to them. Both of these are interpreted facts about how we're observing the universe. What Beale and Polkinghorne and theists as well want to say is that the universe is not simply something that is mechanical. We're not simply looking at a mechanical working that as soon as we find out how all the gears are working and all the inner workings of the machine, that as soon as we know how this machine works, then it's simply explained and there's no more mystery. The base point is that theists will say that there is a creativeness to the way that we see the universe that is not simply able to be described by mere mechanical process. Others dispute this, but this is what Polkinghorne and Beale want to say about the world. Do you agree with Stanley Jackie's invocation of Gödel's incompleteness theorem as an argument against the possibility of developing a theory of everything that is necessarily, not just contingently, true? Hawking, as I understand it, even admits that Gödel's work will complicate the consistency of a united theory, does he not? If Gödel's work does throw a wrench into the works, why hasn't the physics community caught on to this? Why, after his many walks with Gödel in Princeton, was Einstein not dissuaded from pursuing a grand unified theory? Where to begin on this one? Let's first start with what exactly is being talked about here. When you hear the terms grand unified theory of everything, you can perhaps make an inference that this sort of grand unified theory is something that explains everything accurately. That's roughly how you can describe that theory. The challenge with this, as has been mentioned before, is that for some reason, the mathematical principles that work for subatomic particles, for quantum physics and things like that, simply do not work when we look at the very, very big systems of general relativity, and vice versa. The actual math doesn't seem to work, and there has to be a relationship there somewhere. We simply don't know where it is. And how to reconcile that grand unified theory is something that Einstein was certainly interested in doing. But, however, there was a challenge to even the concept or prospect of being able to use science or mathematics in that way in the first place. And this is where Kurt Gödel comes in. Now, Kurt Gödel was a mathematician who was also a philosopher of mathematics, and he proposes certain theorems that turn out to have some merit to them in the philosophical sense of, in a logical system, because mathematics is a logical system, the logical system can neither prove itself to be true, nor can that you actually prove individual statements of that logical system to be true. There is an incompleteness to either one of these things, the system itself and even the language of the system. Now, this might seem way, way, way over everyone's head. Let me give an analogy of this, and it's called the liar's paradox. And the liar's paradox is simply one sentence long, and it is this particular statement. This sentence is false. Now, based upon the data that we have of this particular sentence, we can perhaps say that it is neither true nor is it false because of the paradox. If the statement is false, then the statement itself is false. Do you see? So if this sentence is false, then we all of a sudden have a quandary because then it becomes true. But again, if this statement is false, is true, then the construction of that sentence also gives an indeterminacy about the system of the sentence. It is something that is both self-referential, but it's also something in which we are questioning the very vocabulary and linguistics of the construction of that data. And this paradox is something that is referred to as being built into mathematical principles as well, logical systems. In a mathematical system that is purely a logical system, the challenge that Gödel's theorems point to is that truth, capital T truth, is something in which, even in the logical system of which we use particular ways of syntactic logic, or logic of language, logic of mathematics, that these things actually, at least in this theorem, point to that we actually cannot actually say that those are true in the first place. Another philosopher, William Lane Craig, of the Christian tradition, has actually pointed to these sorts of theorems and saying that science actually as a system, following arguments like this, science as a system is not self-provable. In other words, what science simply says to us in data format is not self-referentially provable. That gravity is a certain meters per second squared, the acceleration of gravity, is not in and of itself self-referentially provable. It is simply a reference point. Again, this is a subjective reference point in which we are making observations of the universe through that can never really be either proved true or false, but are simply the data. To actually talk about the previous couple of questions that we got in this book, the point is, there seems to be a conflict between believing that we can accurately describe the universe in an objective form versus the actual mathematics used to describe the universe in what we believe is an objective form actually being indeterminate. And this is what Gödel's theorem says, as opposed to what Einstein was looking for in there is a way that we can explain everything objectively and determinately, not indeterminately. Now, let's bring this all back to perhaps language that we can all kind of talk about. The point in this theorem, or the point in how we're describing the theorem, is that there is more to truth than simply the logical. And if we were to simply describe things just as logical systems, the challenge with this particular theorem of this is that you actually would not be able to do so on a purely logical basis. There is capital T truth that is beyond logical explanation. And again, that might seem counterintuitive, but the point is that there's more to the truth of the world than simply the logical. Let's take an actual example of this potential paradox in an actual biblical direction. The parables of Jesus. When Jesus tells parables in the New Testament, parables are not, we would say, actual accounts of real people. Take, for example, the sower parable. There was once a man who went out to sow a field. And of course, we get the explanation that the types of things that the sower is sowing is an analogy or metaphor for the one who sows the word. And the thing is, though, is that, Jesus is probably not bringing up like a specific circumstance of there was this one guy who went to sow one time. It's a generalized statement. It's a story. It's not meant to be taken as there literally was a sower one day who decided to get up in this particular way. Rather, it is a story told to illustrate a deep truth about the world in which the story itself is not what we would say logically, factually true in the sense in which it is an actual account of history. Rather, what it is instead is it is a story told to illustrate a real truth about the world, but through a fictional story. Now, the thing is that no one, I think, in their right mind would say that these parables do not portray truth about the world. This is the whole point of story in the first place, by the way. This is why we tell certain stories to kids about be careful about touching fire, and don't touch the hot stove, and be careful whenever you're doing certain activities. There are all kinds of instructive stories that we tell that are not merely meant to be logically consistent with themselves, but they're meant to illustrate a wider truth about the world. Taken in a non-mathematical sense, this is exactly what we get to when it comes to literature, when it comes to scripture, when it comes to writings, when it comes to stories. There are wider truths about the world than simply the syntactical, logical truths about it. And we would say, at least within the Christian tradition, that is how God created the world to be. God is not just this mathematical principle that simply is arranging all of these things based upon all of these different phenomena. God is the force that gives a rise and gives sustaining to that, but God is not merely that. God is an actor who is an agent, someone who has a will, someone who has a will to do so, but also someone who has attributes to themselves that are, as perhaps we would say, at least in the general sense, personality. There is a way in which God reveals the divine activity within the world in a way that is deeply personable, not merely logical. And so what this question asker is getting at is that there is a tension between the attempt to describe the universe in its fullness and complexity as a mechanical system, and that truth is not contained merely within this description of the logical mechanical system. It's a paradox. It really is a paradox, and it also is a principle that Gödel describes in the mathematical fashion that perhaps we can describe analogically through literature and through the examination of our Holy Scriptures themselves. This is not something that needs to scare us off from either science or faith. This is something in which both science and faith have to talk to each other about, and in which perhaps we can say with a little bit more certainty that there is a realm beyond merely the logical. There is not just meaning, but there are descriptors of the universe that are not contained only within mathematical systems, such that science needs something outside of itself. Science needs something that is outside the logical system to be a complete truth about the universe.